Good morning, art history, and welcome back to another screencast in art history. We have a few topics to explore today. We're really going to be looking at painting from approximately 1940 to about 1980. We're going to start with the post-World War I return to figural art. Let's see, is that working? Yeah. And figural art is something that is worth sort of like exploring briefly. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but figural art is basically using the human figure as a focus. And we know that much of the art that we've studied in the early 20th century, so like 1900 to about 1920, most of that art has focused on abstraction, and that abstraction has been a reduction of nature and has sort of moved away from figural art and the human figure. And so what we're really talking about here is as we get to the second half of the 20th century, there's a return to the human figure. And then after we talk about that, and by the way, this is really something we're going to be talking about that is more global in some sense as well. So the abstraction that we focused on from 1900 to 1920 was really something that was focused in Paris. Cubism, Fauvism, two of the most important movements in art, were both birthed by artists working in Paris, France. The figural art that we're going to look at is really something we see going on in a lot of other places around the world besides Paris. And then we get to the second half of the 20th century, approximately 1950, we're going to explore abstract expressionism, which is really, art historians will basically say this is the first major American artistic movement, and it's centered in New York City. And a lot of people will say that when you look at abstract expressionists, like, for example, Jackson Pollock, and the fame of Jackson Pollock, and then the pop art movement afterwards, that the center of art has dramatically shifted in the second half of the 20th century from France to America and to New York specifically. So after the abstract expressionists, we'll look at the pop artists, of course, Andy Warhol, and then do a very, very brief review. I want to start today's lecture a little bit by kind of reading through some of the content area for essential knowledge that they've pulled out, and I want to kind of like circle some of the things that I think are really important for this lecture. So starting with this first one, it says artists assumed new roles in society. We already talked about that a little bit in our previous lectures and screencasts, where we talked about how academies and governments were no longer really responsible for the new movements of art, but rather individual artists were, as they say here, proliferating or spreading their own artistic styles and exhibiting together as opposed to as part of an academy of any kind. Styles of art proliferated and often gave rise to artistic movements. Art and architecture exhibited a diversity of styles. So art has a diversity of styles. It's really important. Again, if we go back to the 1920s and teens, 1907 to like 1911, pre-World War I, you've got the Fauves, you've got the Cubists, you've got the Symbolists, you've got neoplasticism, you've got non-representational art, you've got all of these different styles emerging. Diverse artists with a common dedication to innovation came to be discussed as avant-garde. People like Picasso, right? Subdivisions include, and this obviously content area 4 goes all the way back to the 1700s, so neoclassicism, romanticism, realism, impressionism, post-impressionism, symbolism, expressionism, cubism, constructivism, abstraction, abstract expressionism. So what we're really interested in this lecture is a couple things. Surrealism is something we're going to talk about. Talk a little bit about abstraction. We already talked about cubism and constructivism. We're going to talk a little bit about abstract expressionism, pop art, performance art, earth and environmental art are things that we kind of already talked about when we did the lecture on sculpture. We jump down here. It says the philosophies of Marx and Darwin affected worldviews. We already talked about the ideas of Marx. We haven't so much talked about Darwin, but today we are going to be talking about colonialism and the effect of not the Industrial Revolution, imperialism. And of course, social Darwinism is always something that you want to discuss in the context of colonialism. So we'll kind of like explore that a little bit. The next one here says artists were initially bonded by sanctioned academies and pursued inclusion in juried salons. This means that artists wanted to be part of the academy and that there were juries, right, who decided what good art was, right? So that's initially. By the time we get to post-World War II, right, artists are no longer interested in that. In fact, the really great work of art that we already talked briefly about, Duchamp's Fountain, sort of indicates a couple things. One, academies are no longer in the 20th century going to be deciding what good art is. When you have a jury, and I think that the show that the Fountain was supposed to be part of gets to this point. When you have a jury, that creates a new form of power structure that tries to decide what is art and what isn't. And in the 20th century, there's this real movement towards, you know, the artist deciding what is art and not other people. And so they try to move away from that as well. The influence of academies recedes in favor of radical individualism. And that's really the period that we're looking at here as we jump into this. This is really about architecture, so we're going to move on from that. Art of this era often proved challenging for audiences. And I think that's one of the things that is probably most difficult for us to do in terms of distance learning, is for me to talk about why, why painting matters in the 20th century when it's, you know, for example, a series of cubes or colors and things like that. You as students are going to be incredibly challenged to sort of understand this as in the same way that you understand, you know, like a Da Vinci or a Michelangelo, because we're constantly sort of like faced with this question of like, well, formally speaking, this isn't anything really all that wonderful. And I think that's a big part of the challenge for audiences, is that the formal elements are not spectacular. And so I think it's really important that when we look at this, you know, concept, that we have to go back to the context, and we have to go back to the idea of conceptual art to understand the function of art from this time period. Okay, so let's jump into post-World War I, return to figural art. Let's just look at this really quickly. I showed this in my last, I think, or 2 videos ago. We look at Cézanne in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, and the way in which he gives way to proto-cubism, and the way proto-cubism gives way to cubism. And you can see quite clearly in this trend toward abstraction the reduction of figures, not only the human figure but also nature itself, into increasingly abstract components that look more and more like just geometric figures. And that I think you see quite clearly here. This is the utmost abstraction in terms of reduction into simple squares, for example, right? And so there's this clear movement away from the human figure. If we look at expressionism, which I like to look at expressionism as kind of like a counterpoint to abstraction, you know, where abstraction is a reduction of form, expressionism is a decision to look to color as opposed to other formal elements as the key component of expressing ideas and feelings and emotions. And if we start here with, again, post-impressionist Edvard Munch, we know that this piece, you know, captures a human figure, right? Even as we get to the Fauves, we know that this is capturing nature. But by the time we get to someone like Kandinsky, nature and the human figure have been reduced down almost to the point where you can't tell that they're there anymore. And then finally, when we get to Mondrian, this is very much, I think, a kind of expressionistic piece, neoplasticism. And yet, the human figure and nature itself has been entirely removed from this. And so we see this clear trend toward the removal of the human figure. I think Duchamp's The Fountain also clearly indicates a removal and abstraction from nature and things like that, right? The decision to omit formal elements so completely. How do you omit formal elements completely? you don't even paint, right? You don't even sculpt. You just pick up something from a hardware store. And by contrast, if we look at the work of someone like Frida Kahlo in Mexico, her work is entirely utilizing the human figure. If we look at Wilfredo Lam, who is a Cuban artist, and although he was a Cuban artist, he actually spent an immense amount of time in Paris. He actually was sponsored by Picasso, and you can, I think, quite clearly see the influence of Cubism in his works. We also see a return to figures. They are primitivistic human figures, and they are abstracted human figures, but they're nonetheless human figures. When we look at the work of Jacob Lawrence, which we've looked at before, we can see a clear return to the human figure. So you have this continual line of abstraction up through to about 1930, and then somewhere around 1930 to 1940, you have this return to the human figure, and I think all of these works reflect that return to the human figure. And this one of the things that's kind of interesting is that where all of the abstraction was going on, a lot of this was going on in Europe, right? This here is in Mexico, and so it's much more global. This here is a Cuban artist, and although he was based in Paris at the time, and of course we know that this here is an American artist. So the return to figural art was really something that happened not in France and Paris per se, but was something that was going on in other places. And there were different reasons that people experimented with figural art. Frida Kahlo, for example, was really interested in her personal identity, right? And the exploration of her own personal identity was something that's had a larger resonance, I think, with a larger Mexican community, because her personal identity was obviously made up of her native Mexican or Nahuatl identity, right, that traditional sort of Aztec, along with her European identity. And so she is, in her own personal identity, she is the conqueror in the form of the European, and the conquered in the form of the native Aztec, right? And you can kind of think about the inside of her own self. How do you sort of like express your personal identity and the notion of who you are when who you are is made up of this duality of both the conquered and the conqueror, right? How do you sufficiently express your native roots while also celebrating your European roots? How do you capture religious identity as it's associated with Aztec and Nahuatl religious ideas, while also exhibiting Catholic concepts and things like that? These were all things that Frida Kahlo explored as she explored self-portraits. She tended to spend a lot of time engaging in these self-portraits. And these self-portraits were really interesting because they bucked the trend. And I want to be very clear right now. Like, the new tradition of the 20th century is to be increasingly abstract, to reduce nature down into cubes and shapes and colors. And she's completely gone in a completely different direction by returning back to the figural art, engaging in self-portraits that attempt to explore notions and ideas of colonialism, especially as it relates to her own personal identity as a Mexican woman, right? Her work oftentimes also explored her own personal past, and her personal past was rooted in problems with her medical health. And you can see this hemostat here, which is like a clip. I use them when I go fishing. They're great for tying fishing knots and lures and things like that. If you ever go fishing, you should really get a hemostat in your fishing vest. But that's besides the point. They're also used in the medical community. And so, like, if you have a vein like this that's bleeding, you can use the hemostat, and it clips to it, and it shuts off the blood from spilling. You could do the same thing on, like, a tube, right? Any kind of tube. You can clamp that down, and it stops it from flowing. And so here she's got this native heart, right, that is connected through a series of arteries to this European heart that European heart is then connected to a series of arteries where she's bleeding. And so what is the nature of that? Well, probably stems from the fact that when Frida Kahlo was a younger woman, I think she was in her 20s, she was in a bus accident. And she was traveling through Mexico City on a bus, and the bus crashed. And one of the poles that you hold on to that are like railings and things like that dropped down somehow. And it's an incredibly gruesome story. And she was flung forward, and the pole impaled her. It was shoved right through her abdomen and damaged her spine. And she had to spend a tremendous amount of time in the hospital. And her nerve endings were damaged. And as a result, she at times would feel spikes of pain throughout all of her nerve endings and all of her fingers and skin and things like that. And she oftentimes would paint these portraits of like her spinal column as a broken column, like a Greek column, right? So she'd take the notion of a column and turn it into a Greek column and then shatter the column to sort of like capture the sort of medical diagnosis of having an injured spinal column. And so she has this long history of medical problems, and the pole went through and damaged her womb. And a lot of people look at this little piece right here and think that it might have something to do with like a baby. I think that it actually has a small portrait of Diego Rivera on it. I'm not sure if we can zoom in on it. You can't really tell. But it might be the kind of object that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz has on her frock when you look at that image of her on her chest, kind of like a sort of religious icon. But it also looks like almost like an embryonic sort of thing, and because it sits directly on the sort of other side of this object here, some people have hypothesized, and because it sits near her womb, that this painting is actually about her, partially about her inability to have children, because of the wounds that she experienced in that bus accident. Interestingly enough, some of what Frida Kahlo has said is that, her road to health back after the accident, one of the things that she did is she would take a mirror, and she would flip it up to a canvas because she couldn't move her neck, and so she couldn't actually hold her head up to look at a canvas, and she used painting as a way of helping her to sort of come back. So from that, and so she's quoted in some places as noting that painting was sort of a lifeline for her and gave her a reason to live after that. And so, in some sense, this is a work, not this work itself, but painting for her was cathartic, meaning it was healing and had a sort of healing component to it. And I think that her explorations of her personal identity were also a method of catharsis, a method of healing, of dealing with the various issues and roots. And I want to point out that her exploration of her personal identity is not simply personal, because all people in Spain were made up of these component parts, right? We looked at the Costa paintings previously that talked about how, like, a Spaniard and an Indian produce a mestizo, right? She is definitively mestizo, right? A component part of these two different groups, right? And so her work could also be kind of cathartic for other people who were sort of struggling with national identity, and personal identity and colonial identity, in a world that is rapidly becoming a post-colonial world, where after World War I, post-World War I, people were beginning to be like, okay, wait a second. If nationalism and if imperialism were causes of these wars, right, then shouldn't we get rid of these things? Shouldn't we strip ourselves of our colonial possessions, and things like that? And Mexico was one of these countries. Mexico had a socialist revolution, was rapidly turning towards communism, had already won its independence from Spain, was looking to develop a government that was a revolutionary government, and Frida Kahlo was married to Diego Rivera, who was a very famous painter. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo were both friends with communists, and in fact, in 1922, somewhere around there, in 1922, when Stalin Joseph Stalin came to power. One of the ways that Joseph Stalin came to power was by chasing out his main competition, Leon Trotsky. And Leon Trotsky, who was a favored leader of Vladimir Lenin after Lenin's death, Trotsky had assassins sent after him, and so he fled, and he went to the most communist socialist country he could find, which happened to be Mexico, and he befriended Frida Kahlo. And so one of the things that I think is really, really important, so like, what does communism have to do with this? Well, this is clearly an image that explores the notion of colonialism and is trying to make amends with the past of colonialism, and communism is by far one of the most anti-colonial concepts out there, right? Anti-colonial. Communists believed that imperialism and colonialism was an outgrowth of capitalism, right? And so they criticized imperialism as just another form of capitalism. And there might be some truth to that. I mean, in some sense, we know that a lot of colonialism was seeking resources to feed the Industrial Revolution. So communists believed that colonialism was part of capitalism. And so as a communist, you would also be sort of struggling with your identity in this respect as well. I know I've spent a lot of time on this, but it's an incredibly complex piece that is a really wonderful piece to explore. And I just want to jump forward here really quickly to this piece by Diego Rivera, because obviously the two were married. And in fact, let's see, if I zoom in here, you can actually see this is Diego Rivera here as a younger boy, and here is his wife, Frida Kahlo, sitting right next to him, the artist who we just looked at. And if you look in her hands, it's really hard to see, but she's actually holding in her hand, obviously Diego Rivera painted it in her hand, but she's holding a yin-yang sign. And a yin-yang sign is actually a Chinese symbol of duality, right? And so he recognized that she herself struggled with her European and native sides. And in fact, this painting right here is also an exploration of the history of Mexico and its native leaders and its colonial leaders and the native people who stood up to the Spanish or betrayed the Spanish. Sor Juana is actually in this painting somewhere. You have various leaders like Porfirio Diaz, and you have conquistadors armed to the teeth, and you have revolutionaries like the Zapatistas. And so it's a full sort of exploration of the colored history of Mexico. I just got to point out really quickly that a couple years back, I was down in Mexico in the Yucatan area, and I was in Merida, Spain, which is actually the oldest city. I'm sorry, Merida, Mexico. And Merida is the oldest city in Mexico, oldest European city in Mexico. It was founded in like the 1500s by European conquistadors. But one of the things I found so fascinating is that the trees had flowers in them, and they bloomed yellow and pinks and all these colors. And so the explosion of color that I see up here, to me, feels almost like Fauvism, like this sort of explosion of like color and things like that. And it feels very celebratory. But in some sense, it's actually a legitimate portrayal of many areas of Mexico and the beauty in those places in Mexico. And I think that color and the exploration of color is something that has always been a part of Mexican heritage. That said, Diego Rivera, very much a highly trained artist, and I mean, like, look at the way in which he incorporates this bright yellow dress here, sitting next to this blue figure here, with the red figure here and the blue figure here, sort of creating these wonderful contrasts through triadic relationships. Same here in the balloons, and the slightly converted triadic relationships here of like purplish, orangish, greenish, right? So just sort of shifting on the color wheel slightly to get those same triadic relationships. This is an incredibly complex painting that is the kind of thing that would take me an incredibly long time to delve deeply into. But needless to say, let me just point out that it's a very deep dive into the exploration of the complexity of Mexican identity, as it is made up of not only Spanish colonial history, which is what people tend to focus on when they look at Mexican identity, but it is also made up of this really complex, long history of Aztec, Mayan, and various other groups who make up the identity of the different native peoples of Mexico. And so while Frida Kahlo's becomes a kind of personal exploration of Mexican identity, Rivera's is really a national exploration, right? And is seeking to do something I think quite similar. And I think that's one of the reasons why he put Kahlo here, right, sort of at the center. And you'll notice also that she put Kahlo right next to the Calavera, and the Calavera is this is the Calavera Katrina. I'll just write it out here. The Calavera, which is a skeleton. Calavera means skeleton. The Calavera Katrina, and the Calavera Katrina is a creation of a he's a newspaper cartoonist. His name was Jose Posada. And Posada created the Calavera Katrina as a methodology for, and these cartoons as a form of political cartoons that he used to oftentimes create what is it called? Political messages and messaging, and like attacking different political parties. And this is actually Posada here, and Posada is right almost in the middle, next to the Calavera Katrina, which tells you something about how important Diego Rivera thinks Posada is. And if you look at the history of Posada and things like that, he really sets the tone for creating news, or better yet, criticisms of the government and things like that I think I believe Rivera believed was really important in informing the masses, right? In informing the masses about the real nature of what was going on in Mexican history. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that the Calavera is almost like this sort of interesting thing where it's mocking the wealthy elite in Mexico by taking an Aztec notion of a dead, a god of the dead, right? And she's wearing a feather boa, which is actually a feathered snake god, which is Quetzalcoatl, right? This feathered serpent god. And then dressing her up in this elaborate dress in the way in which the elites would dress. And the elites dressed like Europeans, right? And so what Posada's doing with the Calavera Katrina is sort of criticizing the Europeans by suggesting that the European elites weren't any better than those who engaged in what is it called? Human sacrifice, right? Like the Aztecs. And I think that like when you look at colonialism, when you look at imperialism, there's almost something to that. There's something to this idea that what imperialists were doing is they were going into societies and they were forcing the people to work, oftentimes to death, right? Sentencing them to work to death in order to extract resources to enrich themselves. And so this was a potent criticism of, I'm going to change colors here really quickly. This was a potent criticism that Posada utilized to criticize the European elites. And if there's one thing that Rivera does, Rivera spends an enormous part of his career criticizing in the tradition of Posada, criticizing wealthy elites that pretended to be European, and dressed in, European clothing, criticizing imperialism. He criticized capitalism and sought to create something that was more for the people. He definitely was more in support of like the Zapatistas and the revolutionaries, who sought to, create a kind of socialist revolution in Mexico. He was, again, a communist. And so Mexico is one of the first nations in South America to sort of like co-opt communism as something that the native people should embrace to overthrow their colonial overlords. Even though Mexico at this time was no longer controlled by Europeans, they were controlled by a class of people who acted European and acted like European elites, and oftentimes had family extensions that went back to Europe and things like that. So these are really, really interesting paintings that explore that duality and explore also class issues, right? Because again, Europeans had more status, more money, as being the offspring of colonial elites in the past. And so I think that both of those paintings explore that. Moving over to Wilfredo Lamb. Wilfredo Lamb's work actually does the same thing, believe it or not. Wilfredo Lamb's work is a work of art that attempts to explore the exploitation. To be exploited. Exploitation means to be taken advantage of, right? And exploitation is a classic thing that we associate with imperialism. So Wilfredo Lamb's work attempts to explore the exploitation of the Cuban people, specifically the Afro-Cuban people, meaning the Cuban people of African descent, whose parents were former slaves. Okay? So that's one. Two, I think we should talk about Wilfredo Lamb's heritage a little bit. Wilfredo Lamb's heritage is fascinating. Wilfredo Lamb, on one side of his family, was his great grandfather was Chinese and was a Chinese immigrant. On the other side, they were African American slaves. Or not African American, they were just African slaves, because obviously they weren't, they were Afro-Cuban slaves, right? And they practiced a religion on that side of his family called Santeria. And if you've listened to, what's that band called? Sublime. You know the line from Santeria. I don't practice Santeria. Santeria is an Afro-Cuban religion. Santeria is a religion that formed when slaves taken from West Africa were forced to practice Catholicism, and so they began to adopt Catholic practices that looked Catholic on the surface, but were in fact practicing Afro-Cuban religious tradition. So Santeria is a religion in the Caribbean that combines elements of Catholicism, of the Catholic religion, with West African traditional religion. Another religion, for example, that combines West African tradition with Catholicism is Voodoo. So Santeria and Voodoo are both what we call Afro-Cuban religions. Another example, just to throw this out there, another example of a religion that combines European Catholicism with elements of West African religious tradition is Rastafarianism. So you guys probably know Rastafarianism, Bob Marley, and reggae music, right? Reggae music is actually the gospel music of Rastafarianism. But anyway, back to Santeria. So this is an image that utilizes Santeria as a religion also to sort of explore these things. Now, Wilfredo Lamb studied in Cuba in the Cuban Academy of Art, but he would eventually leave Cuba and he would go to Spain. He actually fought in the Spanish Civil War, which is so fascinating because he was there in Spain helping to fight in the Spanish Civil War. At the same time, that Picasso is painting his ultra famous Guernica, right? Which explores the fascist bombing of the city of Guernica, right? When the Nazis bombed the city of Guernica in Spain. He's there fighting in Guernica at the same time that people like Ernest Hemingway are in Spain writing news articles about the horrors of the fascists in Spain. And he fought on the side of the Republicans. He was actually severely injured, and after his injuries, he left the war and went to Paris. And it was through his connections in the war and his travels to Paris that he would eventually meet none other than Pablo Picasso. And by this time, Pablo Picasso was easily, hands down, the single most famous artist in all of the world, easily. And Pablo Picasso sponsored Wilfredo Lamb, and when Wilfredo Lamb saw Picasso's work, he was incredibly influenced by Cubism. And so what we have here when we look at Wilfredo Lamb's work is we have a work that that takes a few things and sort of blends them together. Obviously, we have Cubism. We have the religion of Santeria, which is an Afro-Cuban spiritual religion. And then we have also colonialism. And colonialism in this case is the European, Spanish and other European settlements of Cuba, in which they took the slaves there and forced them to harvest sugarcane. And once you sort of realize that, what you're actually seeing here is, in fact, sugarcane everywhere. It almost looks, sugarcane actually looks a lot like bamboo. In fact, I just had this conversation with my daughter just the other day. What was that movie we were watching? Swiss Family Robinson, yeah. And the kid was trying to feed an elephant with some sugarcane, and she said, that looks like bamboo. And yeah, she's right. Sugarcane looks like bamboo. And so here are these Afro-Cuban slaves harvesting sugarcane. And what he has done in the spirit of Santeria is he's actually taken the Afro-Cuban people who are harvesting the sugarcane, and turned them into part animal, part sugarcane, and sort of explores the kind of primitivistic sort of like elements that Picasso would have been inspired by. And we see primitivism in his proto-cubist piece Demoiselles d'Avignon, and I think you see some elements like in this that look almost like Demoiselles d'Avignon. And in doing so, he's sort of exploring the exploitation in the jungle of these Afro-Cuban people and of his ancestors, right? And so he's really trying to sort of make sense of the destruction of culture and the destruction of people and the exploitation of people, but also the birth of new religions in the midst of that exploitation. And in doing so, he's simultaneously also exploring his own incredibly complex identity of being part African, being part Chinese, and I think he also has European blood in him and things like that. And then also exploring the sort of rich traditions of Santeria as a religion. And I think that anybody who sees this understands that this is also a criticism of colonialism and of European imperialism in South America. And so in that sense, it fits very well with Frida Kahlo's work and Diego Rivera's work. All three of these artists are working in South America. Obviously, Lamb is in Cuba, which is off the coast. Kahlo and Rivera are in Mexico. All of them are kind of riffing to some degree or some extent on different trends that are coming out of Europe. A lot of people say that Rivera and Kahlo's influences were coming from Surrealism. Lamb's influences are obviously coming from Cubism. And so that once again sort of adds to this sort of complexity of South America as we sort of think about the role of and the history of art in Mexico. This piece I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because I think we already know a little bit about it, but the thing that I will say is that this is obviously by Jacob Lawrence. This was a series. This is part of a series, and it's really important to remember that this is part of a series, because whenever I think of like, hey, this is a painting that's part of a series, the thing that I think about is, oh, well then it's probably a good candidate for a attribution essay, right? Because if this is one panel in a series of 49 or 50 panels, then they should be able to pick any one of these other panels, and you should be able to write about the panel as easily as you can write about this one. So Jacob Lawrence is a self-described dynamic cubist. So he saw himself as picking up off where Picasso left off, and then utilizing those sort of flat, planar, geometric elements to create a radically simplified composition. And this is radically simplified in order to get across something of a social and political point, right? And this work, obviously, is exploring this time period in African American history in the United States, known as the Great Migration. And the Great Migration took place in several different parts. Some people would make the argument that the Great Migration actually started in World War I, and it did. It absolutely did. When soldiers were drafted to go off to fight, a lot of different jobs opened up in the North, in places like Chicago and Detroit. And so a lot of people in the South, especially sharecropping Southern farmers who were African American and incredibly poor, moved up to the North. This continued through the 1920s, which is why you see the Harlem Renaissance. And then the biggest movement, the biggest shift from the South to the North happened right around 1941, when the United States went to war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And you had this massive, you not only had the recruitment of soldiers, but you also had the United States government really paying to get an expansion, to expand production, right? And that expansion of production in the North, in the heavily industrialized North, opened up the availability of jobs. And so the Great Migration increased. And so the fact that, this is all context for this painting, and it's a really important context, because when we go through the series explores that migration. This is panel number 49, which is actually towards the end of the migration. And so what we have here is a panel that is exploring actually what African Americans experienced when they got up to the North. And so the hope was that as they went to the North, they would find jobs, find opportunities that they didn't have in the South. But what they found was still, as he clearly delineates here, with this great golden line through the middle of this, that there was still segregation. There was still, Jim Crow laws. So this is a restaurant that is segregated, and you can see that separate is not equal, right? You have the diner's experience on this side, the white diner's experience, very different than the African American diner's experience on the other side. They have menus, they have great silverware and all these things like that. They don't over here. And so he's sort of exploring not just the Great Migration, but also the sort of social upheaval and the social issues that people experienced when they arrived in the North. There was no one else, really. There was very few other artists that were sort of a voice for the African American population and the social and political experiences that they had at this time. And so this is very much like a lot of the art that we look at, putting a mirror up to American society at this critical juncture at the beginning of World War I, and looking at, hey, we still have a deeply racist, deeply segregated, deeply problematic society. And it's obviously returned to figural art because it focuses on the human figure as the main tool through which it conveys its ideas. Man. We've done a lot. So now we're going to move to abstract expressionism. And I've already talked about how by the time you get to about 1940, you have a lot, in the beginning of World War I, you have a lot of artists returning to figural art. The return to figural art will be ascendant really after World War II. So post-World War II, almost all artists, many artists are going to return to figural art. Not all of them. But in the post-World War II era, and actually when we get to 1950, around 1950 in New York, that's when we're going to get the abstract expressionist movement. And the abstract expressionist movement here is being represented by Willem de Kooning, and this is Willem de Kooning's Woman 1. And yes, it's a figural painting. But in some sense, it's interesting because I put it down here because I wanted to point something out. As we go through this period of abstraction, right, that starts with the likes of Cézanne and finishes with the likes of Piet Mondrian's composition in red, blue, and yellow, and this continual reduction, right? And then also the decisions to just utilize color over here as the main way of exploring. I think when we get to Kandinsky really truly believed that you could use color alone to play the soul of a human being, right? And to express deep emotion and feeling. When we get to the abstract expressionists, they're pulling from both of these traditions. They are absolutely trying to use color to express, but they're also fully abstracted. And so when we get to the abstract expressionists, I think that before we fully explore Willem de Kooning's Woman 1, I want to point out that the abstract expressionists really had two different camps. Camp 1 was the so under the heading of abstract expressionism, you had two different groups. One was the action painter, and two was the color field painter. And we'll explore both in a second. So the action painter was the artist that was interested in the action of painting, not the finished result. Function is really important to talk about when we talk about the action painter. Function is really important to talk about when we talk about the abstract expressionist action painter. Because for the abstract expressionist action painter, the expression of emotion is not in the finished product. And this right here, by the way, is an action painting. It's a form of action. It's called action painting. It's an abstract expressionist work in which the function of the work is best understood through the actual painting of the piece and not the finished product. So, for example, when you look at the finished piece, here's a few things that you don't know. You don't know that Willem de Kooning painted on this canvas countless times. He would paint over it and he would slash at it with canvas or with his brushes. Slash, and you can see remnants of those slashes as he sort of like attacked the canvas. What you can't see is that he would then wipe away. He would literally take a kind of tool and pull down. So you've got all these slashes, right? And then he would pull down on the paint, pulling it down, and then he would slash at it again. And he would keep doing this sort of cathartic sort of method of slash and pull and slash and pull. And so the painting itself becomes really a record. It is a record. It's recording. It's a record of his action. And his actions, right, the action of painting, creates a kind of cathartic experience. And again, cathartic is such an important word to sort of explore. Cathartic. Catharsis or cathartic is to do something that helps alleviate pain and stress. Catharsis is anything that helps to alleviate, especially mental pain and mental stress. Right? So the action of the painting was a catharsis for Willem de Kooning's mind, right? And it helped him to deal with whatever stress and things he was experiencing. The most famous action painter is probably not Willem de Kooning. The most famous action painter, hands down, is probably Jackson Pollock. And you're probably familiar with Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, right? To call them a drip painting is really to sort of like miss the mark, though, because what he would do is he would stretch out 20-foot by 10-foot massive canvases on his workshop floor, and then he would dip his brushes into different paint, and he would violently fling paint all across his canvas. And so once again, the action, right, is a record of his motion. It's a record of his well-being and his state of mind. And Jackson Pollock, there are countless documentaries you can watch about it. He was an alcoholic. He had all sorts of different mental issues and problems, addiction, and all sorts of things like that. And it was said that he utilized these paintings as a method of catharsis for his troubled mind. And in the post-World War II era, in which you were dealing with people who didn't know what PTSD was, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? In a post-World War II era in which millions and millions of people all across the world, Willem de Kooning was Dutch, but came to paint in America. Obviously, Jackson Pollock was an American, but in this world that was not just the soldiers' PTSD, but the civilians' PTSD, countless cities that had been bombed into oblivion, millions of Holocaust survivors, right? The stress of World War II lingered in the minds and lives of countless people. And this painting that was kind of about a great catharsis and a great sort of like way of sort of dealing with the mental stresses and the lingering effects of like all of the things that people had experienced in this violent century, not just World War II, but also World War I, and the violent things that people had lived through. Abstract expressionism was a way of expressing. Whenever you hear the word expression or expressionism, you should be constantly thinking about the concept of expressing emotion, right? Abstract expressionism was a cathartic way with which to deal with those emotions. And so I think that's really, really important to understand about this. The other form of abstract expressionism was color field painting. And the most important, one of the most important color field painters of the era was Helen Frankenthaler. And of course that's phenomenal, because I mean, like, she was one of the most important artists in this methodology. And I think that it's really hard to say at any other point in history that if you were looking for a representative of an art movement who is the most important person in that art movement, that it was a female. And in this case, it was. And I think that in many ways, abstract expressionism and Helen Frankenthaler was sort of breaking through gender norms and gender expectations, maybe, by producing work that was considered to be of the highest avant-garde quality. What color field painters did is they created these, I want to almost use the word veils. As opposed to slashing and dripping, their preferred methodology was something more like pouring. It was gentle. And what Frankenthaler did would be to take a series of colors and to wash them out with water, pour them out, and let them mix of their own accord. And then after they had mixed, and after they had sort of, and after, you know, there's very little interaction on the artist's side. And so it's very different than action painting. Very little interaction on the artist's side. She'd make these massive canvases, pour these things, and it's, to me, it reminds me very much of psychoanalysis. Freudian psychoanalysis. Because Freudian psychoanalysis is all about accessing the subconscious. And you may remember in our previous lecture talking about the surrealists, right? Who wanted to access the subconscious. And they believed that accessing the subconscious would bring forward memories, thoughts, and ideas about your past that were deeply rooted in your brain that you couldn't consciously think. And once you brought them from the subconscious into the conscious, only then could you make amends with your past and your thoughts and heal the internal mental damage that had been caused by whatever damage you had that sat in your subconscious. So the reason why I think about psychoanalysis when I look at this is because frequently what she would do is she would pour these colors out, and then only afterwards would she title them The Bay, right? Or title her work this, or title her work that. And it's as though the work itself became a kind of free association, psychoanalytic sort of tool to bring forth the subconscious, right? Which she would then title and give a name. Another, my favorite, I should say, color field painter, is Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko is one of the most important color field painters, and he would paint these large, I guess you could call them cubes, but the borders are very, very, very blended. And Rothko is often quoted as saying, like, he would do the same thing over and over again with different colors. So you'd have a certain proportion here and a certain proportion here, and the proportions of one color to the other were really important to him. And so the utilization in his work of a ratio should remind you, I almost put ration, I meant ratio. The utilization of a ratio is something that should remind you of something that the ancient Greeks did. And in fact, he was doing that on purpose because he believed that these works, through the use of a ratio, actually approximated the human form. And so this part is kind of like the head to the body, right? And these were oftentimes massive works. And to be perfectly honest, I always felt like when I was at the MoMA in LA, I can't remember if it was the Museum of Modern Art or the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. I think it was MoMA. To stand in front of this painting, this massive painting, was to kind of be drowned out by these colors and to have everything else sort of like dissolve away and just be left with these colors. And these colors, these incredibly bright orange and saffron orange, you know, felt like you were in a sea of Buddhists, you know, meditating. And it becomes an incredibly sort of, for me at least, to stand in front of this piece was to stand in front of something that wiped my mind and allowed me to kind of like just drift in a sea of orange. Very contemplative, very meditative, very cathartic, and I think very much fitting within the other sort of like types of abstract expressionism, which was using color to express emotion and to sort of like capture something inside of you. And I think all of these works do that. Abstract expressionism and the abstract expressionists, like Frankenthaler and de Kooning and Pollock and Rothko, became some of the most famous artists of the 1950s, put New York City on the map, and would move the center of the art world to the United States. And it would stay there with the pop artists, with Andy Warhol. It would stay there with Klaus Oldenburg's massive pop art sculptures like Lipstick on Tank Tracks. And also Robert Rauschenberg's incredibly wonderful combines, which we don't have here. I wanted to throw up really quickly a few Warhol pieces that you are very familiar with. I think everybody in the world has seen one of Warhol's soup cans. And I think everybody in the world has seen one of Warhol's Marilyn Monroe's, which is a screen-printed piece that uses, both of these are screen prints that use mechanical equipment to create the formal elements of the piece, right? And then it's the creation itself, right, through the screen printing process, and then the meaning of the image and the idolatry of the image and the repetition of the image that sort of create the function and the meaning of the piece. These are pieces that, you know, were produced in the 1960s and were so prescient that they are still 100% I don't know what to say, evocative or meaningful in our own day today. I just think that to look back at a piece like this and then to look at the artists that produce works today that are still derivative, and when I say derivative, that's, man, derivative. Derivative means they're just copying. There it is. To look at the number of pieces that are still just derivations of Warhol's work. I just spelled his name wrong. Is to say that there hasn't really been a great deal of newness and a great deal of creativity. And in fact, going from 1960 to 2020, perhaps it's possible that as much as we like to think a lot has changed from 1960 to 2020, in fact, when you look at, icons and